The night air over the Kunar province mountains was the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin, it reached inside the chest and squeezed. Captain Alara Voss had been in Afghanistan 3 times before, but the mountains never got familiar. They stayed wild, indifferent, and deadly, no matter how many times you walked through them. She moved through the darkness with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned long ago that the difference between alive and dead was often nothing more than the sound of a single misplaced footstep. She was 31 years old, decorated twice, fluent in Pashto and Dari, the kind of officer that commanders quietly fought over and never talked about publicly. The 75th Ranger Regiment had tried to keep her. The Defense Intelligence Agency had tried to absorb her entirely. Instead, she had ended up here, embedded with a Joint SEAL task force operating deep inside a corridor that didn't officially exist on any military map. That was exactly where Alara preferred to be. Tonight's objective was straightforward on paper. Extract a high-value informant named Tarek, a mid-level logistics coordinator for an insurgent network called the Crimson Chain, who had been feeding intelligence to American handlers for 8 months. Tarek had recently sent a message through his handler suggesting he had obtained something significant, something that could expose the entire network's operational structure across 3 countries. But Tarek was scared. He wouldn't move unless an American officer came personally. Command had deliberated for 6 hours. Then they had sent Alara. The team was 12 strong. 4 SEALs, 4 Rangers, 2 signals specialists, a combat medic named Jonas Reed who had been attached to the unit 3 weeks earlier, and Alara herself. They had inserted by helicopter 40 minutes ago, setting down 6 kilometers from the target compound in a dry riverbed that satellite imagery had confirmed as unpatrolled. So far, everything was running exactly according to the brief. That should have been the first warning sign. Alara kept pace with Chief Petty Officer Damian Cross at the front of the formation. Cross was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that came not from having nothing to say, but from having learned that most things didn't require saying. He had been running missions in denied areas for 11 years. She trusted his instincts the way she trusted the mountains to be cold, completely and without question. 200 meters, he murmured into the radio, barely above a breath. Alara scanned the ridge line above them. Something tugged at the back of her mind, a feeling she had learned never to dismiss. The rocks were still. The goats that sometimes wandered these hills at night were absent. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. Everything was quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when someone walks in who shouldn't be there. She pressed Cross's arm once, their signal for slow down. He slowed, she listened. For 3 full seconds, there was nothing. Then the eastern ridge lit up like a sunrise. The explosion was massive. A buried IED detonated remotely, designed not to kill but to scatter. It worked perfectly. The formation dissolved instantly into controlled chaos. Alara was thrown sideways by the pressure wave, her shoulder slamming into a boulder hard enough to send white light across her vision. She was back on her feet in 2 seconds, years of training overriding the shock before her brain had fully registered what had happened. Contact east, contact east, the radio erupted with overlapping voices. Gunfire came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated ambush. These were not opportunistic fighters stumbling onto an American patrol. This was planned. This was prepared. Someone had known they were coming. Rally on me, Cross's voice cut through the noise, calm and absolute. Alara moved toward his position, returning fire as she ran. She could see 2 of her Rangers engaging targets on the left flank, pressing forward with disciplined aggression. She could hear Reed's voice somewhere behind her, calling out a casualty report. She ducked behind a rock formation, reloaded, assessed. The compound was 50 meters ahead. If Tarek was still inside, the ambush meant one of 2 things. Either the enemy had been watching Tarek and had anticipated the extraction, or Tarek himself had given them up. Either way, The mission had just become something entirely different from what they had briefed. She keyed her radio. "Cross, I'm pushing to the compound. Tarek may still be." The blow came from her left, from a direction she had not covered, from a fighter who had been lying flat against the rocks in the darkness, invisible and patient. The rifle butt connected with the back of her skull with the kind of force that didn't leave room for a graceful response. Her legs stopped working. The radio fell from her hand. She was aware dimly of being grabbed, rough hands, urgent movement, the sound of her team's gunfire getting farther away very quickly. She fought. Even half-conscious, she drove an elbow back hard and felt it connect with something that cracked. Someone swore in Pashto. She twisted, clawed, kicked. But there were 4 of them, and she was already compromised, and the darkness was getting thicker by the second. The last thing she was aware of before unconsciousness took her completely was the feeling of being carried, and the distant sound of Cross's voice on the radio, cycling through her call sign over and over, each repetition more urgent than the last. "Voss, Voss, respond. Ilara, come in." She could not respond. She was already gone. Back at the rally point, Cross stood over the empty ground where she had last been positioned. Her rifle was on the rocks. Her radio was 3 feet away. There was blood on the stone, not enough to suggest she was dead, but enough to confirm she had not left willingly. He picked up her radio and held it for a moment longer than was tactically necessary. Then he got on the command frequency and said 4 words that would set an entire chain of events into motion. "We have a missing person." Consciousness returned to Ilara Voss not all at once, but in pieces like a broken signal trying to reconnect. First came sound, the low murmur of voices speaking Pashto in another room, the distant bark of a dog somewhere outside, the steady drip of water hitting stone. Then came sensation. Cold concrete beneath her, metal around her wrists, a pain at the back of her skull that pulsed in time with her heartbeat like something alive and angry. Then came awareness, sharp, sudden, and completely unwelcome. She did not open her eyes immediately. That was the first decision she made in captivity, and it was the right one. She kept her breathing slow and even, her body still, and she listened. Every intelligence officer learned the same foundational truth in the first week of SEER training: survive, evade, resist, escape. And the very first lesson within that truth was simple. Information is power, and the moment you announce that you are conscious, you surrender the only advantage you have left. So she lay still. She listened. She counted voices, 3 in the adjacent room, possibly a 4th further away. She identified at least 2 distinct weapon types by the sound of metal on metal. She estimated the room size by the way sound bounced off the walls. Small. Stone construction. No windows or windows that were covered. Underground, possibly. The temperature was too consistent for an above-ground structure in this region at night. She had been unconscious long enough for them to move her somewhere deliberate. That meant planning. That meant this was not a random capture. They had wanted her specifically. That thought settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She opened her eyes. The room was exactly what she had expected: bare stone walls, a single bulb hanging from a wire overhead casting more shadow than light, a metal chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room. Her wrists were bound behind her around a support pillar. The binding was tight but not perfectly done, amateur work, or the work of someone in a hurry. She filed that away immediately. The door opened before she had time to do anything else with the information. He was not what she expected. She had prepared herself mentally for aggression, for someone who would come in loud and violent, trying to establish dominance through fear. Instead, the man who entered was calm. Medium height, middle-aged, with the kind of careful, measured movements that suggested education rather than battlefield experience. He wore no uniform. He carried no visible weapon. He pulled a plain wooden chair from the corner, set it directly in front of her, and sat down with the unhurried ease of a man who believed completely that time was on his side. He set a folder on his knee. He opened it. He turned it so she could see the first page. Names, photographs, coordinates, allied operatives, people she knew, people she had worked alongside, people who had families and children and lives that extended far beyond whatever war had drawn them into this world. Her stomach tightened. Her face did not move. "Captain Voss," he said in careful, accented English, "we know a great deal about you already, your rank, your unit, your specialization. We know the task force you are embedded with. We know the name of your commanding officer." He paused, watching her face with the patience of someone who had done this many times before. "What we need from you is simply confirmation of what we already suspect. Names, locations, the network." He tapped the folder. "Tell me what I want to know, and this becomes a very short and manageable experience for you." Alara looked at the folder. She looked at the man. She said nothing. Not a word, not a sound, not even a shift in her expression that could be read as acknowledgement. The man studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. He stood, replaced the chair in the corner with the same unhurried care, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and spoke without turning around. "We will try again soon," he said simply. "Rest while you can." The door closed, the lock turned. Alara exhaled slowly through her nose and began working through what she knew. The man was an interrogator by training, not a fighter. His approach was psychological first, establishing the illusion of reasonableness before escalating. She had been briefed on this methodology. It was effective against untrained prisoners because it created a false sense of negotiation, a feeling that cooperation might lead somewhere humane. She was not an untrained prisoner. She also knew what came after the reasonable approach failed. She began preparing for it immediately, not with fear, but with the same clinical focus she brought to every operational problem. Pain was a variable. It could be managed. It could be endured. The mind, properly disciplined, could be made to exist at a remove from the body's suffering in a way that preserved function even when physical conditions became extreme. She had trained for this. She had studied accounts of prisoners who had survived years of captivity without breaking. She knew it was possible because other human beings had made it possible before her. She thought of her father, the coal miner who had worked 11 years with a compressed vertebra because the family needed the income and he was not the kind of man who stopped. She thought of the way he never complained. Not once, not in 11 years. She had asked him once how he managed it. He had looked at her with quiet eyes and said, "You just decide, Alara. You make the decision once and then you don't unmake it." She made the decision now. Whatever they did to her body, she would give them nothing. Not a name, not a location, not a single syllable of operational value. The people in that folder were worth more than her comfort. They were worth more than her safety. If it came to it, they were worth more than her life. She had chosen this work with full awareness of what it could demand. This was the demand. She would meet it. When the door opened again 2 hours later, and the first blow came without preamble or warning, she was ready. She did not make a sound. There is a particular kind of darkness that exists only in places built deliberately to break human beings. It is not simply the absence of light. It is the absence of everything that reminds a person they are still connected to the world. No sunlight, no wind, no sound except the sounds they choose to give you, no sense of time except what they allow you to measure. It is a darkness designed with purpose, and its purpose is singular, to make a person feel so completely alone, so utterly severed from everything familiar and safe, that the simple act of speaking begins to feel like relief rather than surrender. Alara Voss had been inside that darkness for what she calculated to be 29 guard rotations, nearly 10 days. She counted the rotations with absolute discipline, 3 shifts every 24 hours, each change announced by the sound of boots in the corridor and the brief metallic exchange of a weapon being transferred from one set of hands to another. She had scratched a small mark into the stone behind the support pillar every time she counted 3 rotations. 29 marks, 10 days. The scratch marks were the only calendar she had. and she guarded the ritual of making them with the same intensity that a drowning person guards a rope. The sessions had escalated exactly as she had expected them to. The calm interrogator, she had privately named him the professor because of his measured, academic manner, had given way to someone else entirely after the third day. This new man was younger, angrier, and far less interested in the performance of reasonableness. He did not bring folders or photographs. He brought other things. Alara endured each session with the same fundamental strategy: breathe, retreat inward, survive the immediate moment, and then assess damage and recover before the next one arrived. Her ribs had been the first serious injury. 2 cracked on the left side, possibly 3, she could not be certain without imaging, but the sharp, specific pain that accompanied every breath told her enough. She had learned immediately to breathe differently, shallower on the left, compensating without drawing attention to the injury. Showing them where it hurt was the same as handing them a map. Her left eye had swollen nearly shut after the 5th day. It had improved slightly since then, which told her at least a week had passed since that particular session. Her wrists had raw, infected rings from the restraints. She had a gash along her left cheekbone that had not been treated and was healing slowly and imperfectly in the cold, damp conditions of the cell. She cataloged all of it with the detached precision of a physician assessing someone else's injuries. This was not denial. This was management. Emotion about her physical condition would cost her energy she could not afford to spend. What they had not broken, what they had not even come close to touching, was her mind. Every day, she ran through operational protocols in her head the way a musician runs scales, not because she needed to practice them, but because the act of disciplined mental exercise kept the architecture of her thinking sharp and ordered. She recited classified information silently to herself, not to rehearse giving it, but to remind herself of its value. Every name she protected was a person still alive. Every location she kept silent was an operation still intact. Every morning she woke up and said nothing was a morning the network survived. She also listened. This was perhaps the most important thing she did in captivity, and it was the thing her captors never seemed to anticipate. They assumed a prisoner in a cell was passive, waiting, suffering, enduring. They did not account for the possibility that a properly trained intelligence officer never stopped working, even in chains. Alara listened to every conversation that drifted through the walls. She was fluent in Pashto and functional in 2 regional dialects, a fact that her captors apparently had not been briefed on. She heard names. She heard logistical discussions. She heard an argument between 2 guards about a supply route. She heard a senior figure make a phone call in which he referenced a meeting location and a timeline. She memorized everything, all of it, stored it in careful, organized compartments in her memory the way a librarian stores books, cataloged, retrievable, and protected. She had no way to transmit any of it, not yet, but she was already thinking about that problem. On the 12th day, they tried something different. They brought her food, real food, warm and plentiful, and left her unbound for an hour. The professor returned, without his folder this time, and simply talked, casually, about her career, her accomplishments, her family. He knew her sister's name. He knew where her father had worked. He was very deliberate about what he revealed and what he implied, and the implication was clear. Cooperation would mean safety, not just for her, but for the people connected to her. Alara ate the food slowly and said nothing. She was not unaffected by the mention of her family. She was not made of stone. The thought of Maya sitting beside a silent phone somewhere in Virginia sent a pain through her chest that had nothing to do with her cracked ribs. She allowed herself to feel it fully and completely for exactly 30 seconds. Then she folded it away into a place that was hers alone, unreachable by anyone in this room, and she looked at the professor with calm, empty eyes and waited for him to finish. He studied her face for a long moment after he stopped speaking. "You are either the most disciplined person I have ever interrogated," he said quietly, almost to himself. Or you have already gone somewhere I cannot follow. He was closer to correct on the second count than he realized. That night alone in her cell, Ilara allowed herself one small and private act of defiance. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, tilted her head back and smiled, not from happiness, but from something harder and more durable than happiness. From the absolute, unshakable knowledge that they had thrown everything available to them at her for nearly 2 weeks and she was still here, still intact, still silent, still entirely, defiantly herself. 29 marks on the wall, 10 days survived. She reached up and made the 30th. The signals intelligence wing of the Pentagon never truly slept. At any given hour, somewhere inside its layered, climate-controlled floors, analysts sat bathed in the blue glow of monitors, sifting through the endless electronic noise of a world that communicated constantly and carelessly. Most of what they found was static, irrelevant chatter, background radiation of a civilization that had forgotten how to be quiet. The work was meticulous, repetitive, and occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, it produced something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand completely upright. Corporal Tina Marsh was 26 years old, 14 months into her first posting, and by her own private admission, still not entirely sure she was cut out for work that required sitting still for 10 consecutive hours. She was sharp, thorough, and possessed of an almost obsessive attention to pattern, a quality that had gotten her flagged for signals work during basic assessment, and had landed her here, in this particular chair, on this particular night, starring at a frequency band that should have contained nothing except atmospheric interference and the distant bleed of commercial satellite traffic. Except it didn't contain nothing. There was something in it, faint, almost insultingly faint, the kind of signal that any analyst in a hurry would have scrolled past without a second thought. But Marsh was not in a hurry. She was never in a hurry when something didn't look right, and this didn't look right. The signal had no consistent amplitude, no commercial signature, no identifiable source profile. What it had was rhythm. Not the accidental rhythm of interference patterns, but the deliberate rhythm of something constructed by a conscious mind with a specific intention. She pulled her headset off and leaned closer to the monitor, as if proximity might help her hear it better. Short, long, short, short, long. She grabbed her codebook, the physical one, the classified edition that lived in a locked drawer and never touched a networked system, and began cross-referencing the sequence with her pulse running noticeably faster than it had been 60 seconds ago. Most distress codes used by American military personnel in denied areas were designed for brevity and recognizability. They were built to survive degraded transmission conditions, to remain identifiable even when the signal carrying them was fractured and weak. They were built, essentially, for exactly this situation. The sequence matched on the fourth cross-reference. Marsh sat back in her chair and stared at the screen for 3 full seconds without moving. Then she picked up her desk phone, bypassed the standard reporting chain entirely, and called the direct line for the duty officer with hands that were very clearly not steady. "I need you to look at something," she said when he answered. "Right now, please." The report reached Colonel Marcus Hale at 3:40 hours at Bagram Airfield, where he had not slept in 31 hours. He read it standing up, still in his jacket from the previous day, a cold cup of coffee forgotten on the desk beside him. He read it once quickly and then again slowly, and by the second reading his jaw was set in a way that his staff had learned to recognize as the expression that preceded decisions being made at significant speed. He knew the code sequence. He had personally overseen the classified training session in which Ilara Voss, along with 11 other senior intelligence officers, had been issued their individual distress signatures. Each sequence was unique. Each was tied to a single officer. There was no possibility of misidentification, no margin for coincidence. The signal being received in the Pentagon's signals wing, faint and fragmented and miraculous, belonged to exactly one person on the planet. She was alive. More than alive, she was communicating. Somewhere inside whatever facility they were holding her, with whatever materials she had been able to find in a cell designed to contain and diminish her, Alara Voss had built something capable of generating a transmissible signal, and had been sending it with enough discipline and regularity that a 26-year-old analyst 14 months into her first posting had been able to pull it from the noise of the atmosphere. Hale sat down slowly in his chair and allowed himself exactly 5 seconds of something that was not quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. Then he picked up his own phone and began making calls. The device Alara had built was not impressive by any engineering standard. It was, in the most literal sense, the minimum viable version of what she needed it to be. A length of wire pulled over the course of 4 days from a deteriorating section of her cot frame. A small capacitor harvested from the broken remains of an overhead light fixture that had been improperly replaced and left partially accessible from her corner of the cell. A cracked piece of circuit board she had found wedged beneath the door threshold on the 8th day, debris from something, she didn't know what, and didn't need to. She knew what she needed it for. The construction had taken 6 days of work performed exclusively during the hours she calculated the guard rotation was at its most inattentive, the deep middle of the night shift, when the human body's circadian rhythm creates a natural trough of alertness that no amount of training fully eliminates. She worked in darkness, by touch, assembling components she could barely see with fingers that were stiff from cold and damaged from restraints. She made mistakes and corrected them. She started sections over twice. She nearly lost the capacitor on the 5th night when a guard made an unscheduled check, and she was forced to flatten everything beneath her body and lie motionless for 11 minutes while he stood in the doorway with a flashlight. The device could generate only the weakest of signals. She knew this. She also knew that weak was not the same as silent, and silent was the only condition that guaranteed failure. She had no way of knowing if anyone was listening. She had no way of knowing if the signal was reaching anything at all. She transmitted for 10 minutes every night at the same time, cycling through her distress signature in the pattern she had memorized during that classified briefing 2 years ago, in a conference room in Virginia that had felt entirely theoretical at the time. It did not feel theoretical now. She transmitted into the darkness with the faith of someone who had done everything within her power, and was now trusting that on the other end of whatever thin wire of signal she was casting into the atmosphere, someone was paying attention. Corporal Tina Marsh had been paying attention. And now, in a small room at Bagram Airfield, Colonel Marcus Hale was staring at a geographic corridor on a classified map, and reaching for the phone to call the one unit he trusted to go into that corridor and bring his officer home. There is a particular kind of briefing that special operations personnel learn to read not by what is said, but by what is deliberately left out. The pauses, the careful word choices. The way a commanding officer holds eye contact a half-second longer than necessary when delivering certain lines. Chief Petty Officer Damian Cross had sat through hundreds of operational briefings across 11 years of service. He had developed, through sheer accumulated experience, an almost clinical ability to identify the shape of information that wasn't in the room. This briefing had a very specific shape. Colonel Hale had given them the geographic corridor, the signal intelligence summary, the compound layout derived from a combination of satellite imagery and a single human intelligence source whose reliability was rated at 70%, which, in Cross's experience, meant the layout was probably accurate and the guard count was probably wrong. He had given them the extraction protocol, the medevac coordinates, the abort conditions. He had given them everything a thorough, professional briefing should contain. What he had not given them was a condition report. "Asset is alive and transmitting," Hale had said, and then moved on to the next slide with the smooth efficiency of a man who had rehearsed exactly how long to spend on that particular sentence. Cross had let it go during the briefing. He did not let it go afterward. When the room cleared and the other team members moved to the equipment staging area, Cross stayed behind. Hale was gathering his materials from the table with the focused attention of a man who was hoping the room would empty faster than it was. "Colonel," Cross said simply. Hale looked up. "Condition report," Cross said, not a question. The two men looked at each other across the empty briefing room for a moment that contained considerably more information than most conversations. Then Hale set his folder down and spoke quietly and directly, the way men speak when they have decided to stop performing and start communicating. "She has been in their custody for 31 days, he said. "The signal she is generating is weak but disciplined, which tells us her cognitive function is intact. Her physical condition is unknown. What we can infer from the pattern of her captivity and the nature of the people holding her is," he stopped, started again. "Prepare your medic." Cross nodded once. He picked up his helmet from the chair beside him and walked out without another word. He found Jonas Reed in the equipment bay, running through his medical kit with the systematic thoroughness that Cross had come to deeply respect in the 3 weeks Reed had been attached to the unit. "Pack for significant trauma," Cross told him. "Orthopedic, internal, neurological. Pack like you won't have time to go back for anything." Reed looked up from his kit. He was 28, calm-faced, with the kind of steady hands that belonged to someone who had made a private peace with high-pressure situations. He studied Cross's expression for a moment, then turned back to his kit without comment and began adding items. That was one of the things Cross valued most about Reed. He understood when a situation had already answered its own questions. SEAL Team 8 inserted at 200 hours under a sky that offered nothing, no moon, no stars visible through the cloud cover, only the particular darkness of a mountain night that pressed down like a physical weight. They had inserted 6 kilometers from the target compound and were moving on foot, which was slower and harder and significantly less likely to announce their presence than any alternative. The terrain was uneven and rocky, the kind of ground that punished inattention with a turned ankle or a displaced stone that clattered down a slope and carried further in the night air than anyone wanted. Cross ran the formation from the front. 8 operators behind him in a staggered column, Reed near the rear where a medic belonged during an approach. They moved in absolute silence, the practiced, deliberate silence of people for whom noise discipline was not a rule but a deeply internalized reflex. No equipment rattled. No boots scraped. They were, as far as the mountain was concerned, not there at all. At 4 kilometers out, Cross's point man, Petty Officer Second Class Danny Rourke, who had the eyesight of something that hunted at night, raised his fist. Everyone stopped, everyone dropped. Cross moved forward in a low crawl until he was beside Rourke, who pointed without speaking toward a ridge line to the northeast. Cross raised his night vision and looked. 2 sentries, positioned above the trail, not moving, which meant they were either very disciplined or very cold or both. Their placement was good, overlapping fields of view, elevated position, decent cover. Someone had set these positions thoughtfully. This was not a compound staffed by amateurs. Cross studied them for 90 seconds, timing their attention patterns, identifying the moments when both sightlines were directed away from the approach corridor simultaneously. The window was approximately 4 seconds every 90. It was enough. He signaled Petty Officer Marcus Webb, the team's best mover in close terrain, and indicated the left sentry. He signaled Rourke for the right. Both men nodded. They waited for the window. When it came, they moved. It took 11 seconds. Both sentries were down without a sound. The team pushed forward. The compound emerged from the darkness gradually, first a wall, then a roofline, then the faint amber bleed of interior lighting through covered windows. The satellite imagery had shown a rectangular structure with 2 outbuildings and a single entry point on the southern face. What the imagery had not adequately conveyed was the size. The compound was larger than the model had suggested. A second structure connected by an enclosed corridor on the eastern side, invisible from above due to a camouflage overhang that someone had been very deliberate about installing. Cross adjusted without pausing. He split the team, 4 operators to secure the outer perimeter and manage the 2 remaining exterior sentries, 4 to push inside with him and read. He designated rally points. He confirmed abort conditions. He gave the team 30 seconds to internalize the revised plan. Then he pushed the door. The interior was dim and smelled of diesel fuel and something older and worse. They moved through the first level in under 4 minutes. Storage rooms, a communication setup that one of his operators photographed thoroughly before they moved on, a sleeping area containing 2 men who were now zip-tied and unconscious. No resistance, no alarms. Either their approach had been genuinely undetected, or they were moving towards something that someone wanted them to find. Cross filed the second possibility away and kept moving. The stairwell to the lower level was at the eastern end of the main corridor. It went down further than the compound's above-ground footprint suggested, 2 full flights, the air getting colder and damper with each step. At the bottom, a corridor ran left and right. To the left, 3 cell doors, all closed, all padlocked from the outside. Cross moved to the first door. The signal coordinates had been imprecise, a corridor, not a room. He raised his hand to knock in their prearranged pattern. Before his knuckles touched the metal, a voice came from behind the third door. Quiet, controlled, speaking in English with the specific cadence of someone who had been listening to approaching footsteps for the last 90 seconds and had already made several decisions about what they meant. If you're friendlies, your point man favors his left side when he moves downstairs. Tell him it's audible. Cross lowered his hand slowly. He looked at Reed. Reed looked at Cross. The voice behind the third door had just demonstrated active observation, pattern recognition, and tactical communication from inside a locked cell after 31 days in captivity. Cross walked to the third door, found the padlock, and signaled for the bolt cutters. The padlock gave way with a single clean cut, and a sound that seemed enormously loud in the cold silence of the underground corridor. Cross pulled the door open with one hand, weapon raised in the other, and stepped back to create space and sightline simultaneously. The reflexive choreography of someone who had opened doors in hostile environments enough times that the body did it without consulting the brain. What was behind the door stopped him in a way that very few things in 11 years of service had managed to stop him. She was standing, not sitting against the wall, not lying on the floor, not huddled in the corner the way people looked after a month in a place like this. She was standing back pressed to the far wall, weight distributed evenly despite everything her body had clearly been through, a makeshift blade fashioned from a sharpened piece of cot frame held low and ready in her right hand. Her left eye carried the faded remnant of significant bruising, yellowed now at the edges, which told Reed immediately that the injury was at least 2 weeks old. Her lip was split and had healed imperfectly. There was a gash along her left cheekbone that had closed on its own without any treatment whatsoever. Her uniform was torn and stained. Her wrists bore the raw, darkened evidence of prolonged restraint. But her eyes were the same eyes that had been in her intelligence file photograph, sharp, dark, and completely, absolutely present. There was no vacancy in them, no dissociation, no 1,000-yard stare. She looked at Cross and his team with the focused, assessing gaze of someone who had been expecting company and was in the process of determining exactly what kind. Cross spoke first, quietly, clearly, and with deliberate calm. Captain Alara Voss, Chief Petty Officer Damian Cross, SEAL Team 8, we are United States military. You are among friendlies. 3 seconds passed. She studied his face, then Rurk's behind him, then moved her gaze methodically across every operator visible in the doorway the way someone reads a document they intend to remember. Then her eyes found Reed, the medical bag, the red cross marker on his sleeve, and something in her expression shifted by a fraction that most people would not have noticed. She lowered the blade, and her legs, which had been holding her upright through some remarkable act of sustained will for God only knew how long, decided that the emergency was over. Reed was already moving before she started to fall. He covered the distance in 3 steps and caught her with both arms, taking her weight with the practiced ease of someone who had caught falling people before, guiding her down rather than letting her drop. He lowered her to the floor carefully and had his medical bag open before she had fully settled. "I've got you," he said, standard words. He said them automatically, but he meant them completely. "I know," she said, and her voice was hoarse and quiet and entirely steady. "I heard you coming down the second stairwell. Your left boot has a loose sole. It creates a slightly different sound on the downstroke." Reed paused for exactly 1 second in his assessment. Then he continued working. Her pulse was fast and thready, dehydration and sustained physical stress. Her skin was cold and carried the particular grayish undertone of someone whose body had been running on deficit for an extended period. He checked her pupils, equal and reactive, both of them, which was better than he had feared. He ran careful hands along her ribcage and felt her control her reaction with visible discipline when he reached the left side. "Ribs," he said. "3," she confirmed. "Left side. The third one may be a complete fracture rather than a crack." The pain profile changed around day 12. He looked at her. "I've been monitoring it," she said simply, as if this were an entirely normal thing to report. He moved to her wrists. The restraint wounds were infected, both of them, the skin broken down and weeping in the way that happened when damaged tissue was exposed to cold and damp for weeks without treatment. He began cleaning and dressing without comment, working efficiently, keeping his expression professional and neutral. This was something Reed had learned in the hardest possible classroom, that a medic's face was part of the treatment. Alarm in his expression cost the patient something they could not afford to spend. But his internal assessment was considerably less neutral than his face. What had been done to her body over the past 31 days was extensive and deliberate, and would require weeks of proper medical care to address comprehensively. The visible injuries were significant. The invisible ones, the internal bruising, the nutritional deficit, the accumulated toll of sleep deprivation, and sustained physical and psychological stress, were impossible to fully assess in a cold underground corridor with a flashlight and a field kit. She needed imaging. She needed IV fluids. She needed a proper surgical evaluation of the rib fractures. She needed 100 things that were not available in this room. What she was doing, instead of receiving any of those things, was talking. "There are 19 personnel in this compound," she said, her voice low and steady while Reed worked on her wrist. 14 are currently sleeping in the upper level, 3 in the eastern annex, 11 in the main structure. 4 are on exterior patrol running a 40-minute rotation. 1 is in the communications room on the first floor." She paused. "Your team photographed that room on the way through. Good. There are 2 hard drives in the bottom drawer of the desk unit that were not visible from the doorway. They will need to be retrieved before you leave." Cross, standing in the doorway, had stopped pretending to monitor the corridor and was listening with his full attention. "The senior interrogator sleeps in the room at the northeast corner of the upper level," Alara continued. "He has a satellite phone. It contains contact information for a network coordinator operating out of Peshawar, a name you do not currently have but should. His name is in the phone under a grocery contact. The pattern they use is third entry in any category for operational contacts." She looked at Cross directly. "You need that phone." Cross looked at Rourke. Rourke was already moving back up the stairwell without being told. Reed finished the second wrist dressing and moved to her face. The cheekbone laceration, the residual bruising around her eye, a small but deep cut above her right eyebrow that she had apparently not mentioned because it was healing adequately and therefore did not rank as a priority in her personal assessment of her own injuries. He cleaned it carefully and applied a closure strip. "You need to tell me if anything feels wrong internally," he said. "Chest pain, shortness of breath, abdominal pain, anything." "The breathing is managed," she said. "Shallow on the left. I have been compensating since day 3. For 31 days. Approximately 28 of those," she corrected, with the precision of someone who found inaccuracy genuinely uncomfortable even under present circumstances. Reed sat back on his heels and looked at her for a moment, just looked, as a human being rather than as a medic assessing a patient. What he saw was a woman who had been subjected to a month of sustained, deliberate cruelty, and had responded by becoming, if anything, more organized, more focused, more operationally effective than most people manage to be in comfortable circumstances with full access to sleep and nutrition and safety. He had treated soldiers who had been through difficult things. He had never treated anyone quite like this. "Can you walk?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. She was not the type to answer with bravado rather than accuracy. "With support for the first level," she said. "I will manage the stairs if you stay on my left side." "Deal," he said, and offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. And then, before she allowed herself to be helped upright, she reached beneath her and retrieved the small, crude transmission device she had built over 6 nights in the dark. She held it for a moment, looking at it with an expression that Reed could not fully read. Then she placed it carefully in the outer pocket of his medical bag. "Evidence," she said quietly, "of what is possible." Reed zipped the pocket closed without a word. Then he helped her to her feet, settled her weight against his left side, and walked her out of the cell and into the corridor, and toward the stairs and the cold mountain air, and the long, complicated road back to the world. Behind them, in the empty cell, 30 marks were scratched into the stone wall behind the support pillar. Every single one of them, a day she had refused to disappear. Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany was the largest American military hospital outside of the United States, and it had seen things that would restructure a civilian physician's entire understanding of what the human body could survive. Trauma surgeons, there had developed a particular kind of professional composure, a settled, unshockable steadiness that came from years of treating people who had come back from places and experiences that defied easy categorization. They were not people who were easily impressed. They were not people who used words like remarkable casually or without clinical justification. The attending physician who oversaw Ilara Voss's initial evaluation used the word remarkable 3 times in the first 20 minutes. The imaging confirmed what Reed had suspected in the field and documented in his medevac notes with the careful, precise language of someone who wanted the record to reflect exactly what he had observed. 3 rib fractures on the left side, 1 complete, 2 partial. Significant soft tissue damage across multiple areas consistent with repeated blunt force trauma over an extended period. Bilateral wrist infections that would require aggressive antibiotic treatment. Malnutrition consistent with 31 days of severely inadequate caloric intake. A healed orbital fracture around the left eye that she had sustained somewhere around day 5, and that had knitted back together without any intervention whatsoever because there had been no intervention available. What the imaging also confirmed, and what prompted the attending physician's third use of the word remarkable, was the absence of anything worse. No internal bleeding, no organ damage, no spinal injury despite the mechanism of her initial capture. Her brain, subjected to a month of sleep deprivation and psychological assault, and the residual effects of the blow that had rendered her unconscious on the night of her capture, showed no structural abnormality on the imaging. Cognitively, neurologically, she was intact in a way that the attending had not fully expected when he reviewed the preliminary field notes. He said as much to her directly, because she was the kind of patient who asked for direct communication and received anything less than that with visible impatience. "Your body took significant damage," he told her on the second day of her admission. "Your mind, from everything we can measure, did not." "I know," she said, not with arrogance, with the simple, factual tone of someone reporting an observation they had already made independently. She spent 3 weeks at Landstuhl. The first week was medical, procedures, treatment, rest enforced by a combination of physician instruction, and the physical reality that her body had been running on emergency reserves for a month, and had very firm opinions about what happened now that the emergency was over. She slept more than she had slept in years. She ate carefully and consistently under nutritional supervision. She allowed her body to begin the long, unglamorous work of repairing itself. The second week, she started asking for a notepad. By the third week, she had filled 4 of them. The debrief was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a secure conference room at a classified facility outside of Wiesbaden, 3 weeks and 2 days after her extraction. The room had been prepared with the standard configuration for high-level intelligence debriefs: a long table recording equipment, a panel of 5 senior analysts drawn from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA's Directorate of Operations, and the National Counterterrorism Center. These were experienced people. Between them, they had conducted hundreds of debriefs of returning personnel, defectors, rescued hostages, and embedded operatives. They had calibrated expectations. They had prepared questions. They had allocated 2 full days for the process, which was standard for a captivity of this duration. They would not need 2 days. Alara walked into the room unassisted, in a fresh uniform. Her posture, straighter than several people in the room felt, was entirely fair given what she had been through 3 weeks prior. She sat down, placed her 4 notepads on the table in front of her, and looked at the panel with the focused, ready expression of someone who had been waiting for this meeting considerably longer than they had. The senior DIA analyst, a woman named Patricia Owen, who had been running intelligence debriefs for 19 years and had long since stopped being surprised by anything, opened with a standard orienting question, a gentle entry point designed to ease the subject into the process gradually, to establish rapport before moving into operationally sensitive material. Alara answered it in 2 sentences and then said, with complete composure, "I would like to begin with the most time-sensitive material first, if that is acceptable. There are 2 items that require immediate action." Owen looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and uncapped her pen. What followed over the next 6 hours was something that none of the 5 people on the panel would describe to their colleagues in the weeks that followed with anything less than absolute candor about how it had made them feel. Alara moved through her captivity with the systematic precision of someone delivering an operational report rather than recounting a personal ordeal. She did not linger on her own experience. She did not dwell on what had been done to her. She moved through it the way a surgeon moves through a procedure, with focus, with economy, with complete orientation toward the objective rather than the discomfort. She gave them 19 names. 14 she had obtained through direct observation, faces she had seen during her captivity, names she had heard spoken in Pashto through walls and in corridors and during the sessions themselves, when her captors spoke to each other with the casual carelessness of people who believed a prisoner could not understand them. 5 additional names she had derived through inference, patterns of communication, chains of command revealed by the deferent structure she had observed between individuals, the way certain names were spoken with a particular lowering of the voice that indicated both familiarity and hierarchy. She provided 4 compound locations. 2 she had identified from directional audio, the way sound traveled through the facility, the orientation of vehicle noise, the position of the sun on the 2 occasions she had been moved between sections of the compound. 1 she had triangulated from a partial address she had overheard during a phone call. The 4th she had obtained from a document she had briefly been able to read upside down during an interrogation session, when the professor had been careless about where he placed his folder. Upside down, in a room she was not supposed to be reading anything in, while managing 3 fractured ribs and a healing orbital fracture. The analyst from the NCTC, a man named Gerald Foss, who had spent 22 years in intelligence work and considered himself genuinely difficult to impress, set his pen down at that point and simply looked at her for a long moment without writing anything. She provided 2 attack timelines incomplete, she acknowledged, because she had only heard partial planning discussions, but sufficient to provide a directional alert that could be refined with additional collection. She provided the name of the network coordinator in Peshawar, the one she had told Cross about in the corridor during her extraction, the one that had been retrieved from the satellite phone exactly as she had specified. The analysts confirmed they had the phone. She gave them the context that the phone alone could not provide. Then she opened the 3rd notepad to a specific page and slid it across the table to Owen. "This is the name of a double agent currently embedded within a partner intelligence service," she said. "He has been in place for approximately 2 years based on the timeline of compromised operations I was able to reconstruct from conversations I overheard during my captivity. The evidence is circumstantial but multi-sourced and consistent. I would recommend treating it as credible pending verification." The room was very quiet. Owen looked at the name on the notepad. She looked at Alara. She looked at the name again. "You developed this intelligence," Owen said carefully, "from inside a cell during your captivity." "I had time," Alara said, "and they spoke Pashto around me freely because they did not know I understood it." She paused. "That was their most significant operational error." Gerald Foss picked his pen back up. His hand, several people in the room noticed, was not entirely steady. The information Alara provided that Tuesday morning in Wiesbaden would, within the following 72 hours, trigger the dismantling of 2 active Crimson chain cells across 2 countries. It would enable the rescue of 3 Allied operatives who had been under active sentence of execution. It would provide the intelligence community with a structural map of a network they had been trying to fully understand for 3 years. She had gathered all of it in silence, in a cell, in chains, in pain. When the session finally concluded, nearly 6 hours after it had begun, Patricia Owen sat for a long moment after Alara had been escorted out of the room. The other analysts were quiet around her, processing, making notes, preparing action items that would keep entire teams busy for weeks. Owen looked at the 4 notepads still sitting on the table. "In 19 years," she said quietly, to no one in particular, "I have never seen anything like that." Nobody in the room disagreed with her. The ceremony had no name on any official calendar. It appeared in no public record, generated no press release, and would never be referenced in any document that circulated beyond a very small and deliberately limited circle of people. The invitation, if it could be called that, had been delivered personally by hand to each of the 11 individuals who attended. No plus ones, no exceptions. The location was a wood-paneled conference room in a building whose address was not publicly associated with any military function, in a city that had no reason to be looking for something like this. 11 chairs, 1 podium, 1 flag folded and standing at attention in the corner, and 1 woman, standing near the window when people began to arrive, looking out at a gray November sky with the particular stillness of someone who had learned, in the hardest possible school, how to simply exist inside a quiet moment without needing it to be anything other than what it was. Colonel Marcus Hale arrived first. He had aged visibly in the weeks since her extraction, not dramatically, not in any way that would register to someone who didn't know him well, but to people who did. There were new lines around his eyes and a particular quality of exhaustion that hadn't been there before. The 31 days of not knowing had cost him something. He would not have said so aloud to anyone. He didn't need to. He crossed the room to where Alara stood and looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had prepared something to say, and was now finding that the words felt inadequate in the actual presence of the person they were intended for. "You look well," he said finally. "You look tired, sir," she replied. He laughed, a short, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him slightly. "Fair," he said. Then more quietly, "I'm glad you're here, Captain." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said. And in those two words was everything that did not need to be said aloud between a commanding officer and an officer who had spent 31 days carrying the weight of a decision he had made to send her. The others arrived in the following minutes. The 5 intelligence analysts from the Wiesbaden debrief, Patricia Owen, Gerald Foss, and 3 others whose names would not appear in this account for reasons that remained classified. 2 senior officers from the Joint Task Force Command, Corporal Tina Marsh, who had been flown in from the Pentagon in civilian clothes and who stood near the back of the room looking simultaneously honored and overwhelmed by the company she was keeping. She was the youngest person in the room by nearly 8 years, and carried herself with the careful, precise dignity of someone determined not to show it. And then, arriving together through the side door with the quiet, coordinated ease of people who move through the world as a unit, SEAL Team 8, Cross at the front, Rourke beside him, Webb, who had retrieved the satellite phone from the northeast corner room exactly as Alara had specified, and Jonas Reed, who positioned himself near the wall with his arms folded, and his face carrying the composed, private expression of a man who had seen something that had rearranged several of his previously settled assumptions about human capability. When the room was full, Hale moved to the podium. He did not speak for long. This was not the kind of occasion that benefited from lengthy oratory. The people in this room did not need context or narrative. They had all, in their different ways, been inside the story. What they needed was simply the formal acknowledgement of something they already knew. He spoke about the mission, about the 31 days, about the signal that Corporal Marsh had pulled from the atmospheric noise with the attentiveness that had made everything that followed possible. He nodded toward Marsh as he said it, and she straightened almost imperceptibly, which Cross noticed and which produced, very briefly, the closest thing to a soft expression that his face was currently capable of. He spoke about the extraction, about what Cross and his team had found in that underground cell, about what Reed had documented and treated and carried back in 4 notepads that had subsequently occupied the attention of the intelligence community for weeks. Then he stopped speaking about events and spoke about a person. He said that in 30 years of military service, he had known a great many exceptional officers. He said that exceptional was a word that suffered from overuse, that it was applied too broadly and too casually until it lost the specific gravity it was supposed to carry. He said that what Captain Alara Voss had done not just survived, but functioned, gathered, protected, communicated, and ultimately delivered intelligence of a quality and comprehensiveness that had directly saved lives, was something that the word exceptional was not quite large enough to contain. He said that the military had a word for it, several words actually, arranged in the formal language of a citation, but that the words in the citation were, like all formal language, a compressed and imperfect representation of something that was ultimately too human and too specific and too remarkable to be fully captured by any document. Then he asked Alara to step forward. She walked to the front of the room with the same steady, unhurried gait that Reed had first observed when she had been standing in that cell with a makeshift blade in her hand. A gait that said, without aggression or performance, that she had decided a long time ago how she was going to move through the world, and that nothing that had happened to her had changed that decision. Hale unpinned the Distinguished Service Cross from its case with hands that were, for the first time in the memory of anyone who knew him, slightly unsteady. He pinned it to her uniform with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who understood that he was performing an action whose significance exceeded its physical simplicity. Then he stepped back and saluted. She returned the salute, held it a beat longer than protocol required, then lowered her hand and turned to face the room. She spoke for less than 3 minutes. She did not call herself a hero. She said the word made her uncomfortable because it implied a quality that existed independently, something a person simply was, regardless of circumstance. She said she didn't think that was how it worked. She said that what had happened in that cell was not the product of some innate and special quality that she possessed and others lacked. It was the product of a decision. A single decision, made once, in the first hours of her captivity, and then honored every day thereafter regardless of what honoring it cost. She said the decision was simple, that the lives connected to the intelligence she carried were worth more than her comfort, worth more than her safety, worth more than the cessation of pain, which her body had requested, loudly and persistently, for 31 consecutive days. She said she had grown up watching her father make a version of the same decision every morning for 11 years, that she had learned from him that the decision was not made once and then automatic. It was made again every single day, in every moment that tested it, renewed each time not from some reservoir of superhuman endurance, but from the simple, stubborn, entirely ordinary human refusal to unmake a commitment that mattered. She looked at Cross and his team as she said this. She looked at Marsh. She looked at Reed. "You were all part of the decision," she said quietly. "Every person who does their job with that kind of care is part of someone else's ability to hold on. I want you to know that I knew in that cell that people like you existed, that someone was listening, that someone would come." She paused. "That knowledge is not a small thing. It is not a small thing at all." The room was absolutely silent. Cross unfolded his arms. He brought his hands together once, firmly, a single clap, deliberate and unambiguous. Then again. Then Rourke joined him. Then Reed. Then Owen and Foss and Hale and Marsh, who was pressing her lips together very hard and clapping with the concentrated intensity of someone channeling considerable emotion into the safest available physical outlet. The applause was not loud or long. It didn't need to be. In a room of 11 people who collectively understood exactly what they were acknowledging, volume was beside the point. Afterward, when the formal portion was concluded and the room had softened into the quiet, unhurried conversation of people who had been through something together and were in no particular hurry to leave each other's company, Reed found himself standing beside Alara near the window where she had started the evening. He had been thinking since Wiesbaden about what to say to her. He had drafted and discarded several versions. None of them had felt right. In the end, he simply said, "The device you built, the transmission device, I still have it." She looked at him with a question in her eyes. "I kept it," he said. "I don't know exactly why. It just seemed like the kind of thing that shouldn't be discarded." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the November sky had gone fully dark. "Keep it," she said finally. "And when you have a hard day, when something feels like too much, take it out and look at it. And remember that it was built in complete darkness, with broken hands, out of pieces that were never meant to be anything at all." She held his gaze steadily, and it reached across the atmosphere and found exactly the right person. Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the quiet gravity of someone receiving something they intended to carry carefully for a very long time. Outside, the night was cold and clear, and full of signals that most people would never learn to hear. Ilara Voss heard all of them. She always had. End of story.